I'm the Eggman. I am the Walrus.
Hey, what's up everyone? This is Joey with Last Few Spins, and I've done a few album reviews here on this channel, but this will be my first one that's kind of like a classic album review. So previously, like a year ago, I listened to all of the Beatles albums because obviously if you're going to be a music lover, you need to know the Beatles albums. However, I kind of felt like maybe even though I gave each one like a few listens, I might have like rushed through them and didn't let them, sink in like I should have. So I want to go back and revisit some of those Beatles albums, and the first one that I decided to do is Magical Mystery Tour. So the reason that I picked this album to revisit first was because I actually had it number 2 on my list of favorite Beatles albums behind Abbey Road. So I thought it'd be interesting to go back and see if this one would grow on me even more with repeated listens and take over that number 1 spot. So you're going to have to find out at the end of the video if that happens or not, but there are many things that I discovered throughout my increased exposure to Magical Mystery Tour that I want to discuss in this video. So the first of 3 things that I discovered is that the songs Flying and Blue Jay Way, they really connected with me a lot more than they did previously. Flying being kind of like an instrumental that, sometimes I have a hard time getting into instrumentals. Because I do love lyrics so much. As I'm exposing myself to more music, I'm realizing that not everything has to be this like fully fleshed out song, so I kind of can appreciate it more in the context of the album, how that song works. And then with Blue Jay Way kind of growing on me, kind of more of a psychedelic song. And lately I kind of find myself enjoying music like that even more. Just like this year, a couple weeks ago, there's a new album by an artist named Panda Bear called Sinister Grift that kind of channels this like 60s psych sound. So whenever you think of a song like Blue Jay Way, like this is the 60s psych sound. So, it definitely clicked with me a lot more, a George Harrison track that's just super cool. I can see why, maybe my first few listens of this album, it didn't click right away, but once I really let it set in, it's got me hooked now. So my second discovery in this re-listen is that the song Your Mother Should Know, I really appreciate the simplicity of it a lot more. Like right after Blue Jay Way, where we're kind of in this dream state, we come down from this and we get a version of the Beatles that's a little bit more grounded, but they just pull off this sound so well. It's almost like you can instantly relate to this song, even if you like literally might not. In terms of the lyrics, it's just something that feels so familiar. It's like an old comfortable pair of shoes that you put on. So I definitely love that track now. And the third realization that I got from listening to Magical Mystery Tour some more is that, at the time that this was released, this must have been otherworldly. I can't imagine like the buzz and the electricity that something like this would have like created in the musical landscape of the time, where there wasn't a lot of stuff like this out there. And, with the Beatles, they weren't afraid at this point in time to push themselves and really kind of expand on the sound that they had already created and already became superstars from, with Sgt. Pepper's coming before this, or being wrapped up before this. Just the inspiration that was found within this music, it's inspiring to me to listen to it. And I imagine, there's all kinds of artists and fans that, feel the same way about this album. So I wanted to comment on all the tracks kind of in order of how they're sequenced on the album. Of course, the lead-off track is the title track, Magical Mystery Tour. And when I first heard this song, I thought, this is like a song that would be played at the beginning of a film. Like, it feels like the opening to a movie. And then, I come to find out that, no, that's literally what it is. It just has this quality, like the way the music's kind of performed and written, like you're getting opened up to this new world. I think that's a really cool aspect of it. For Magical Mystery Tour, this was kind of a project that Paul McCartney was inspired to do after they finished Sgt. Pepper's. Where it seemed like immediately they got back in the studio and they started, not only writing these songs, but planning the film that would go along with it. Then the second half of this album, it's kind of more just singles, but I'll kind of get into that more later in the video once we hit those tracks. So the second song on the album is called The Fool on the Hill. And it's also kind of like this really like film-like track where, to me, I kind of feel like it's the type of thing where some characters or whoever it is would be like walking through a forest and kind of moseying through, and then like the flute breakdown within that song, it's almost like they've stumbled onto some locals, and they just decided to jam around a campfire or something like that. I think that's a really cool thing about this song and just Beatles music in general. It seems like they're so good at kind of giving us the landscape to use our imagination of like how we could see this song playing out, or just this album playing out. And what I take from a song might not be what you take from this song. So I think that's a really cool thing about it, is that their music was so innovative and so meaningful, and just let's be honest, so damn good that you can just you can imagine so many different scenarios with it, and that's what I take away from Fool on the Hill. Then of course the third and fourth tracks I've already talked about, Flying and Blue Jay Way. Just a good way to settle into the album. Of course, Blue Jay Way being a little bit more experimental. Your Mother Should Know being the fifth track. Of course, maybe a more grounded version of the Beatles, like we talked about earlier, after Flying and Blue Jay Way being a little bit more unconventional. So then I Am the Walrus is next. One of my favorite tracks on Magical Mystery Tour, which is the sixth and final track of what would be known as kind of like the film version, or the first EP, I guess, in this first half of this project. I don't think the lyrics are really supposed to like mean anything, but it's just a John Lennon track that's super catchy, fun to sing along to. I mean, who doesn't love to do that cuckoo ka-choo? That's just an iconic part of Beatles music history, in my opinion. This track, even though it has its quirks and its kind of silliness, it ticks every box for what makes a song great, and it's one of my favorites for sure. So in my research about this album, the story that I kind of take from it is that these first six tracks that I just talked about, they were kind of meant for this soundtrack for the Magical Mystery Tour film. And the record company thought that it was too short to be considered like an LP, but too long to be an EP. So they thought, what if we just take some of the singles of the era and just tack them on, and then you can release it as sort of this, album that's a normal length. From what I understand, the Beatles weren't really fond of this idea, but regardless, the record company or the record label, however you want to say it, prevailed, and this is what happened. So we get Magical Mystery Tour being 11 songs, but it's like the first six are from the film, and then the last five are not really meant to be in that same universe. However, at the very last track, I do kind of like take some different soundscapes that almost apply to this first half. So I want to talk about these last five tracks that I feel are kind of like a murderer's row of just classic Beatles songs. So Hello Goodbye, a great Paul McCartney track. What I love about this one is it feels like he's kind of playfully hitching along with somebody that just clearly doesn't want him around anymore. I don't know if this is a situation where maybe like, a girl's breaking up with him and he's just kind of like tailing her, walking down the street, just like, come on, stop being crazy. We're not going anywhere. That's kind of just the nature that I feel this song represents, kind of the vibe. So that's a great one. I love Hello Goodbye. So Strawberry Fields Forever is the next track on the album. And just the opening of the chorus, the let me take you down, 'cause I'm going to Strawberry Fields. He sings that like 4 different times throughout the album, and honestly, it could be 40 more times. I just love that kind of that chorus, the introduction to the chorus. It's not really like sung with much conviction, but you can just feel it. Like it's packed such a emotional punch, and it's on top of this music that just feels like it's plunging you into some kind of dream. Ringo Starr, he develops this like drumming pattern that almost makes you feel like you're falling, or being whisked away somewhere. Regardless of kind of like how you think of that, like I just got to say that this song just really takes me somewhere. I don't know. Wherever I'm sitting and I hear that song, it's like I go somewhere else, and that's a cool thing about this one for sure. So the song Penny Lane, the lyrics kind of refer to a street in Liverpool that Paul McCartney was fond of growing up. So this track, he kind of lists like several different memories that he has from that place, from that time period. And I've got to imagine that this song is like underrated in the realm of being like a fond of your hometown anthem, if that makes sense. Like maybe I'm not like super over the moon, fond about my hometown. I mean, it's a nice little small town, but whenever you hear Penny Lane, there's so much joy and just good feelings and nostalgia from Paul McCartney here, as you kind of walk along this musical sidewalk that he's guiding you along. Baby You're a Rich Man is the next to last song on the album. And amongst this, what I called earlier like a murderer's row of great Beatles songs or singles, this one, doesn't necessarily stand out in this group of songs, especially in this half of the album. I think if this was released on an earlier Beatles album before they started experimenting and kind of getting into that psychedelic sound, I think this would stand out and be one of the best tracks on one of those. But just here on Magical Mystery Tour, it's a great song, but it doesn't really hold water like kind of the songs around it, in my opinion. All You Need Is Love caps off Magical Mystery Tour. The little like intro, I'm not the craziest about in terms of thinking of it as an individual song, but in the whole album as a whole, I think that's where it does kind of like tip the cap to the first half, where it's kind of more like film-like. So it is a good, maybe a good little addition to the song, but really the strength of it is once it gets into the song itself. All You Need Is Love just sounds like this positive anthem that's kind of found itself, as like many Beatles songs have, within the ether of just the world in general. Just a feel-good tune that never gets old. And I also really love the She Loves You tag at the end. Or towards the end, I think that's kind of a nice touch as well. In terms of the production of this album, for it being released in 1967, you're obviously not going to find any better, in my opinion. And it's funny because there's, newer albums like the one I mentioned earlier, Panda Bear, that, they kind of try to emulate that 60s sound. And, a lot of artists like that do a really good job, but there's still just something special about that magic that was made in the studios, back in those decades, the 60s and 70s, that you just can't replicate fully. This album's obviously mixed really well. It's a Beatles album. It's not going to be lacking really in those qualities in terms of the production. So I definitely love that aspect of it. In terms of if there's anything that I would change about Magical Mystery Tour at this point, in my previous listen, like a year ago when I first went through all the Beatles albums, Flying and Blue Jay Way would have held the album back a little bit for me. To think about that now, I was crazier than hell for thinking that. But, because obviously those songs have kind of been shored up in my mind, and then some of the rest of the album I fell in love with even more. So really, I can't think of anything I would change about this album other than maybe adding another kind of psychedelic song, maybe in that last half. Here I am, like a year ago, I wouldn't have said that. I would have said the psychedelic song needs to go, and now I'm like, let's maybe add another one of those. But really, it's amazing the way it is. I wouldn't really change anything about it. So who do I think this album is for, in terms of like a music listener? I think it's not for someone that only casually listens to music. Obviously the singles on here are, Hello, Goodbye, and All You Need Is Love. They're going to connect with that, but as an album as a whole, maybe it's not going to be for everyone because of the kind of experimental nature of some of it. But if you are a music lover, obviously this is going to be right up your alley. Just give it more than like 3 listens. Don't be like me. I've now settled in and listened to it 8 or 9 times fully. And you know, sometimes the best music takes those extra listens to really connect with. So in terms of how this album rests on my current Beatles rankings, it's still number 2, but obviously it doesn't have any room to go really. I do want to re-listen to Abbey Road again, and also I'm kind of inspired to re-listen to many other Beatles albums. So, you know, if you have any suggestions of the Beatles album that you'd like me to hit next, or really any other classic album, I kind of want to dive into some of these that I maybe didn't give enough of a chance. Be sure to drop those in the comments, and I'll be sure to, you know, definitely consider that in the future. I'd love to hear your input on that. Before I give my closing thoughts on this album, I also want to invite you to subscribe here to Last Few Spins and like this video. I would greatly appreciate it. You know, to rate this album, I've probably already kind of given it away from my description, but I would give it a perfect 5 out of 5 stars. It's just an incredible piece of music history amongst, you know, so many great albums that the Beatles released back in such a short time period too. That's what's really impressive about their career is all this stuff that's stood the test of time. It's you know, decades ago, but it really was in such a short time frame, and that's that goes to show just how great musicians of musicians that they were, and artists, and their creative minds. And it was just hitting on all cylinders at this point in time. So that about wraps it up for my thoughts on Magical Mystery Tour by the Beatles. I feel like there's a lot of Beatles fandom within me that hasn't been unlocked yet. And, you know, this is kind of a fun way for me to do that, is produce these type of videos and give me reason to, you know, research and really dive into these some more. So, but until the next time that you see me, I want to thank you for watching and hope you all have a great rest of your day or night. Thanks.